Senator, good morning. Welcome.
Good morning, Barry.
So Karl Batar says that his brief goes well beyond poker machines. He'll be working on tourism and what he says, in quotes, problem gambling.
Well, that's right. According to Karl Batar, people aren't coming to Australia for the Great Barrier Reef or Uluru or the Sydney Opera House or the Flinders Ranges. They're all coming over just to spend a bit of money in Crown Casino. I mean, it is laughable. And the fact is, in other countries, Karl Batar couldn't get away with this. In the US, there are strict rules between those who work in the executive arm of government, political staffers, and working for companies against the very interests for which the government they worked with were advocating. So Karl Batar couldn't get away with this in the US, but apparently he can get away with it here.
We'll talk about the rules in a moment, but he does make the case that Singapore, for example, has significantly boosted its tourism through 2 new casinos. It is a big drawcard to international visitors.
Well, I think the Singapore market, you have a situation in Singapore where the jury's still out in terms of the social impact of that. But the fact is, the issue that Karl Batar will be retained for by James Packer, and James Packer is not a philanthropist, he's there to try and nobble these poker machine reforms. The high rollers come in here not for poker machines, they come here for table games. So there is a clear distinction between the two. Effectively, Karl Batar is going to use his knowledge, his inside knowledge of the Labor Party to try and nobble these reforms. OK,
we'll go to that now about what rules should apply, because he does make the point in that same interview that he's not a minister, he was never an MP, and he was never privy to cabinet discussions. So why should the same rules apply to him?
In the same way that in the United States, if you're a political staffer working for the executive arm of government, you ought not to be able to switch sides within a 2-year period. Karl Batar is in a unique position. He knows how the Labor Party ticks. He has enormous contacts, enormous inside knowledge. He worked at the highest levels with government in terms of decisions being made. So, presumably, including the decision to have some sensible player protection reforms as a result of the deal with Andrew Wilkie. So I think it's a bit rich for Karl Batar to say that all that inside knowledge is something that he can simply go from switch sides to actively campaign against these sensible reforms.
There is a difference, though, between him and a political staffer. Political staffers are paid for with taxpayers' money. He was never paid for in that way. He was paid privately. So it gets a bit difficult, doesn't it, to legislate about what he can or can't do when he was paid through, effectively, a private organisation.
Well, it was paid for by the Labor Party, and the last time I checked, I think the Labor Party got $20 or $30 million in public funding, into taxpayers' funds for election campaigns. So there is a nexus between the two. But I think the key thing here is the level of knowledge that he had at the highest levels of government, and being able to use that knowledge in that way so quickly to switch sides is problematic.
You first got elected to Parliament on a no pokies ticket. The ticket is a little more complicated now, isn't it? It's a poker machines with mandatory pre-commitment ticket.
Well, I think my tombstone will have, here's the no pokies guy. So, to me, this is about some sensible player protection reforms. These reforms are still a quantum leap ahead of the window dressing that we've seen from state governments over the years, who are so hopelessly compromised on the $4 billion a year they rake in poker machine taxes. So these still are significant reforms, and they ought to be supported.
Yes, but you were no pokies in the first place, and Tony Abbott said in the party room, was quoted in the party room during the week as saying, if it's a choice between policy purity and pragmatism, I'll take pragmatism every time. And that's what you're doing, in effect, aren't you? You're negotiating back from a position of no pokies.
Oh, absolutely. And this is still, if we can make a big difference to the 100,000 Australians who are hopelessly hooked on poker machines, losing an average of $21,000 a year each, to the other 280,000 people that are at risk of developing a full-blown addiction, if this will make a difference between people not losing their homes, people getting some control over their lives, then that's a good thing. I think I'll always be known as the no pokies MP or senator, but I'm also trying to be pragmatic. I want to bring about some reforms, and the deal that Andrew Wilkie has struck and the proposals are sensible, and we ought to implement them.
How much of a setback was it when the state governments knocked back the federal government on the mandatory limit?
Look, it was expected. You wouldn't expect the states to do anything else, but it's very clear after the High Court's decision in Work Choices a few years back that the Commonwealth, if it has a political will, can tackle an issue such as gambling. It's got the corporations power, taxation powers, banking and telecommunications powers. There's a whole swag of constitutional powers that the Commonwealth can take the states on, and I'm quite confident if there is a High Court challenge, the Commonwealth will prevail.
but maybe it's more complicated in the Parliament, because now this will be legislation overriding the states. That brings in the whole states' rights issue. Some of the independents, Rob Oakeshott, Tony Windsor, would be nervous about the impact on some of the small towns in their electorate.
Look, I understand that, but I also expect that that both Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott will look at the evidence, will listen to experts like Associate Professor Charles Livingston, who've made it very clear that what is being proposed is people being able to play low-intensity machines where they can still lose an average of $120 an hour, which is a lot of money, but not spend more than $1 per spin, which is what 88% of players do anyway. And if you want to be able to risk thousands of dollars per hour, $10 every 2.3 seconds, then you need to sign up for a mandatory pre-commitment card. I don't think that's an unreasonable reform.
But if they don't support it, how hard do you think Andrew Wilkie will play this? Do you think he will say, well, this is the life and death issue for the government?
No one should underestimate Andrew Wilkie's resolve. Look at his history. Here's a man who had a very comfortable career with the Office of National Assessment, and he threw that away on a matter of principle in terms of the false evidence of so-called weapons of mass destruction. So I think that anyone who underestimates Andrew Wilkie is doing so at their peril.
Do you think those reforms that that Stephen Conroy announced during the week on gambling and the way that it's displayed at sporting events, do you think that was in some way directed at the independents and trying to, or Andrew Wilkie in particular, and trying to placate him on this issue of gambling?
Well, that's something that Andrew's been calling for, I've been calling for a long time, and they are reforms that were supported by the states, and I think it indicates that at a national level we can do a lot in terms of the potential for match fixing, the potential for sporting codes to be corrupted, and at least the Commonwealth government is now looking at that. So I just think it means that the Commonwealth has acknowledged that it has a role to play in winding back the harm caused by problem gambling and the potential that gambling can have on sporting codes in terms of match fixing and compromising the integrity of those sporting codes.
But of course you can bet on just about anything in this country these days. You can now bet on where the government will land with a price on carbon. You can bet on politics. You can bet on outcomes at elections. Should the government be going further?
Well, they should be going further. On Friday released an exposure draft to legislation that will tackle that. I think microbidding gives macro opportunity for corruption, and I think at the last election there was speculation that some party insiders were betting against their own party, and if they've got privy to information, confidential information, polling, if they know what's about to break, that could influence the odds. And I think that we need to clamp down on microbidding because the potential for harm, the potential for corrupting outcomes is just enormous.
Because you can actually bet on the outcomes in individual seats as well, in the marginal seats. And if you're a political staffer and you get access to overnight research, you'd be able to make a fairly safe bet, wouldn't you?
Exactly, and that's one of the things that needs to be tackled, and that's one of the things that is being that I've raised in the bill that I'll be introducing into Parliament shortly, that I hope that the Joint Committee on Gambling Reform will be looking at. So these are issues we need to grapple with. There is an enormous potential for corruption unless we deal with these issues now. And the fact that Stephen Conroy made these announcements recently, I think, indicates that we're well on the way to having a serious national discussion about these issues. Yeah,
for example, when you ran for the Senate in 2007, you must have known that you would almost certainly win a Senate seat. I looked it up. You're $1.50. You could have got $1.50 for every dollar that you put on yourself.
I didn't know there were odds on me, and I didn't punt on myself. So I just think that's a bit off.
As an anti-gambler,
there's something ironical about betting on me. There's something ironical about betting on an anti-gambling candidate as well.
Yeah, but given that you do campaign against gambling, have you ever had a bet? Have you ever had a bet on a Melbourne Cup?
Look, ever since I got elected to State Parliament on an anti-Pokies ticket, I haven't had a bet because I think it'd be politically embarrassing if I won the $15 million Powerball. So I've sort of given away gambling. I think it's one of the small sacrifices I have to make.
Well, just over a month or so from now, the new Senate takes over, and your vote will, of course, lose much of its power. How are you going to play it after June?
Look, I think there's a misconception in terms of what happens in that big red chamber is the be-all and end-all. I think that my vote counted on about 5% of the time. On most occasions, it's how you influence the public debate, how you bring the community with you, listen to the community, influence the way your colleagues vote on issues, and I think that I'll have more time after the 33 sleeps are up to be able to campaign on issues, to actually deal with issues of community concern, and to bring my colleagues with me on issues of concern. For example, I've co-sponsored bills on food labelling where the Greens and the Nationals work together on that, Barnaby Joyce and Bob Brown. I think that it's a matter of convincing your colleagues about the merit of an issue and also getting out there and influencing the public debate.
But from somebody who shared the balance of power, what would you now say to the Greens, who will in fact have the balance of power on their own? How should they play it?
Look, far be it for me to give advice to Bob Brown and his team. I think that they know that there's a heavy responsibility with that, and I expect that they'll deal with it cautiously. And I'm looking forward to continuing to work with the Greens and the opposition, for instance, when it comes to bringing up issues of concern and getting the numbers to get amendments through and motions for Senate inquiries through. I think that's important.
And just finally on how the country might see politics at the moment, the international magazine The Economist, 16-page report, it was scathing about political leaders who said they couldn't peel the skin off a rice pudding. How do you see leadership in this country at the moment?
A great line, and I didn't realise that Paul Keating was writing for The Economist nowadays. But look, I think it's a bit of it's almost like an episode of The Twilight Zone. There's a surreal vibe to Canberra at the moment. The feedback I'm getting just from talking to my friends, to constituents all over the place, is that there's a sense of disappointment. But it's a bit like an episode of The Twilight Zone in that I think we're going to have an unexpected twist at the end, and I'm not sure what that'll be.
What sort of twist? Because at the moment it seems that it seems to be directed at Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott. Should they share most of the responsibility for the way that the public feels about politics?
Look, I think in part, but I think it's more complex than that. I think that people are actually hungering for some leadership, and the point that The Economist made was that we're still the lucky country despite our political leadership, and I thought that was quite telling.
Nick Xenophon, thanks for your time.
Pleasure.